Hey, what's up, guys? Combat Critic here. Let's talk about this upcoming fight between Dan Hooker and Bobby Green. Let's get started. If we take a look at the records of these two guys, starting with Hooker, so Hooker has 35 fights in total and he's won 23 of his 35 fights, lost 12. If we talk about his 23 wins, almost half of them have been via knockout, 7 via submission, and 5 via decision. So pretty exciting fighter to watch. Most of his wins have been finishes, knockouts or submissions. If we talk about his 12 losses, he has been knocked out thrice and submitted thrice, and he also has 6 decision losses. His record when it comes to decision is not very good. He has 5 wins and 6 losses. Now let's take a look at Bobby Green's record. So Bobby has 47 fights. He is a real OG of the MMA game and he's won 31 of his 47 fights, lost 14. If we talk about his 31 wins, he has 11 of them via knockout, 9 via submission, and another 11 via decision. If we talk about his 14 losses, he has been KO'd 4 times, he's lost via sub twice, and he also has 8 decision losses. So his record when it comes to decision is also not very good. He has 11 wins and 8 losses. He also has 1 draw and 1 no contest on his record. Now let's talk about the physical and career stats of these two guys. Starting with the height, it is 6 feet for Dan and it is 5'10 for Bobby. So Dan Hooker will have a 2-inch height advantage. Weight will be even at 155 pounds for both these guys. If we talk about the reach, it is 75 inches for Dan Hooker and 71 inches for Bobby Green. So Dan Hooker will have a 4-inch reach advantage. Talking about the stance, Dan is a switch stance fighter, whereas Bobby is an orthodox stance fighter. And if we talk about the age, Dan is the younger fighter. He is young by about 4 years, and Bobby Green is the older fighter. Age can definitely play a factor in this fight, but let's see some of the other stats as well. If we talk about the career stats, starting with the striking numbers, first up we have the strikes landed per minute. So this signifies the number of significant strikes that you land on your opponents per minute on average. This is 5.08 for Dan Hooker and it is 6.15 for Bobby Green. So Bobby Green will have an advantage here. He is landing quite a bit more number of significant strikes per minute on his opponents. Striking accuracy is 48% for Dan Hooker and it is 52% for Bobby Green. So Bobby will have an advantage here as well. He is more accurate with his strikes. Next up we have the strikes absorbed per minute. Now this signifies the number of strikes that you absorb from your opponents per minute on average. This is 4.76 for Dan Hooker and just 3.66 for Bobby Green. So in this case, the guy with the lower number has an advantage because he is getting hit lesser. So again, the advantage goes to Bobby Green. Striking defense is 51% for Dan Hooker and 62% for Bobby. So again, the advantage goes to Bobby Green. So overall, in the striking department, it is pretty obvious that Bobby is ahead on all of the 4 metrics. Now let's talk about the wrestling and grappling stats, starting with the takedown defense. So takedown defense is 0.79 for Dan Hooker and it is 1.21 for Bobby. Again, an advantage for Bobby. Takedown accuracy is 34% for Dan Hooker and 37% for Bobby Green. So in this case, both these guys are really close, but again an advantage to Bobby here as well. Takedown defense is 80% for Dan Hooker, which is really solid, and it is 74% Bobby for Bobby Green. Both these guys are really close, but for the first time an advantage goes to Dan Hooker. His takedown defense is a little bit better than Bobby Green's. Submission average is 0.4 for Dan Hooker and it is 0.3 for Bobby Green. So both these guys are really close, but a very slight advantage goes to Dan Hooker. Overall, in the striking, Bobby Green is clearly ahead, and in the wrestling, he is ahead. Where he is not ahead is the takedown defense, which is slightly better for Dan Hooker, and the submission average, which is ever so slightly better for Dan Hooker once again. Now let's talk about the significant strikes by position for these two fighters. Starting with Dan Hooker, 85% of all his strikes are from the standing position, just 9% from the clinch and 6% on the ground. If we compare this with Bobby Green, 80% of all his strikes are from the standing position, 11% in the clinch and 9% on the ground. These two guys are pretty even. I don't see any significant difference in these two. Now let's talk about the significant strikes by target for these two guys, starting with Hooker. 62% of all his strikes are to the head, 17% to the body and 21% to the leg. If we compare this with Bobby Green, 59% of all his strikes are to the head, 25% to the body, so he goes to the body more often than Dan Hooker, and 16% to the leg. So Dan Hooker has better leg kicks. He uses leg kicks more in his game compared to Bobby Green. Now let's take a look at some of the previous fights of these two guys, starting with Dan Hooker. So Dan in his last fight beat Dan in his last fight beat Jalin Turner, and this was a good win for him. A lot of people were picking Jalin to win this fight. Jalin was the favorite to win this fight. However, Dan beat him via split decision in a 3-round fight. This fight happened in July of this year. Dan was ahead on the strikes landed column, and he also got one knockdown over Jalin Turner. Before this, Dan Hooker beat Claudio Puelles, and in this fight, he finished Puelles via knockout in the second round. This fight happened in November of last year. In this fight, Dan Hooker got one submission attempt, as well as he was ahead on the number of strikes landed. And before this, Dan Hooker lost to Arnold Allen in a featherweight fight, and he was finished in the very first round via knockout punches. And before this, he lost to the reigning lightweight champion Islam Makhachev, and this was also a finish in the very first round. He lost via Kimura. Before this, Dan Hooker beat Nasrat, and this was a pretty dominant win for Dan Hooker. In this fight, Dan Hooker was ahead in the strikes, and he also got 3 takedown attempts. He was able to win the fight via unanimous decision. And before this, he fought Michael Chandler in his Michael Chandler's UFC debut, and he got knocked out in the very first round. So this man has had some wins and some losses. Now let's take a look at Bobby Green's record. So Bobby Green in his last fight beat Grant Dawson. It's a great win for him. A lot of people were picking Dawson to win this fight, and Dawson was indeed the favorite, and Bobby Green finished him in the very first minute of the very first round via knockout. Before this, he beat Tony Ferguson, and in this fight, he was way ahead in the strikes landed column. He also got a submission and finished the fight via arm triangle in the third round. Before this, he had an NC against Jared Gordon in the very first round due to a clash of heads. And before this, he lost to Drew Dober in a fight where he was actually ahead in terms of the strikes landed column. But Drew Dober knocked him out in the second round to win the fight. Before this, Bobby Green also lost to Islam Makhachev, the reigning lightweight champion, in the very first round. And before this, he also has a win over Nasrat, where he was way ahead in terms of the number of strikes landed, and he won the fight via unanimous decision. Nasrat also lost to Dan Hooker, and you can see the fight right here. In this fight also, Dan Hooker beat him via unanimous decision. Now let's come to the final part where I give my pick. I think I'll go with Bobby Green because he is the better striker. We have seen he is ahead on all the 4 metrics, as well as even in the wrestling, I think he is ahead on 2 of the 4 columns, and the last 2 where Dan Hooker was ahead, the difference between these two were hardly significant. I think Bobby Green beats Dan Hooker by unanimous decision to win this fight. However, Dan Hooker, it's hard to pick against Dan Hooker in a striker versus striker fight because Dan is really good. It will be a really close fight, but I am leaning towards Bobby Green. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. I'll see you guys in the next video.